The meeting hall stretched across 300 meters of polished crystal floor, and Ambassador Chen Wei-lin had walked this distance so many times over the past months that she knew exactly how many steps it took to reach the exit. 417 if she walked at normal pace, less if she hurried. Today, she would hurry. The Galactic Council sat arranged in their traditional semicircle, 12 species representing 12 ancient civilizations that had ruled the stars for longer than humanity had possessed written language. And they looked down at the human delegation with expressions ranging from mild annoyance to barely concealed contempt. Luminar Kaiseth spoke in her crystalline voice that chimed like breaking glass, and her words translated instantly through the neural implants all attendees wore. The Council has been more than patient with your species, Ambassador Chen, but patience has limits, and those limits have been reached. Standing while her delegation of 20 humans sat behind her in perfect stillness, and she had trained them well in the art of diplomatic composure, though she knew their hearts burned with the same fire that consumed her own. "We are listening," Chen said, and her voice carried calm authority across the chamber. The Vexhare Luminar gestured with one crystalline appendage toward the holographic display that materialized between them, and it showed the spiral arm of the galaxy where humanity had spread like wildfire across the stars, each colony marked in blue light against the darkness. 340 worlds, Kaiseth stated, and the number hung in the air like an accusation. Your species controls 340 colonized worlds, and you continue to seed more despite our warnings. We colonize uninhabited systems, Chen replied, and she kept her voice level. We have taken nothing that belonged to another species. Rippled forward, and its aquatic form shimmered within its environmental suit. The reasonable expansion doctrine exists for good reason, human, and every species in this council has agreed to limit themselves to 200 worlds maximum, because unlimited expansion leads to conflict, and conflict leads to war. Shen felt the familiar argument rising again like a tide that never ceased, and they had been through this same circular debate for 3 standard cycles, which translated to roughly 9 Earth months of her life, spent in this glittering prison of diplomatic niceties. Earth's position has not changed, she said, and met each council member's gaze in turn. Humanity will not arbitrarily limit our growth when empty worlds cry out for settlement, and our people need room to thrive. The Kragor representative slammed one massive fist against his seat's armrest, and the sound echoed through the chamber like thunder. You speak of need, but we see only greed, and your pay in greed. Kind breeds like vermin, filling every corner of space you touch. Chen's jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure, even as she felt her delegation shift behind her, and she raised one hand slightly to signal them to remain calm. Kaiseth chimed again, and her tone carried what might have been regret. The council has reached a decision, and we present you with final terms that are not negotiable. The holographic display changed, and new text appeared in humanity's own language, as well as the 12 council tongues, and Chen read the words with a sinking feeling that she had anticipated, but hoped would not come. Humanity must dismantle 140 colonies within 2 standard years, Kaiseth announced, and the chamber fell silent as death. You will reduce your territorial holdings to 200 worlds and accept council oversight of all future expansion, or face economic sanctions, followed by military enforcement if necessary. Military enforcement hung in the air like a threat, and Chen felt something cold settle in her stomach, because this was the moment she had been dreading and preparing for in equal measure. She turned to her delegation, and saw Colonel Martinez meet her eyes with a slight nod, and Dr. Okafor's expression remained neutral, but her fingers drummed once against her tablet, the signal they had agreed upon months ago when they first suspected this outcome. Chen turned back to the council, and she reached down to gather the data tablet and reference materials spread before her seat, and the small sounds of her movements seemed impossibly loud in the waiting silence. "Ambassador," Kaiset's voice carried a note of surprise. "You have not responded to the Council's terms." "There is nothing to respond to," Chen said quietly, and she straightened with her materials clutched against her chest. "Humanity withdraws from these proceedings, and we will chart our own course." Council chamber erupted in a dozen different voices, and alien languages overlapped in confusion and anger. But Chen was already walking toward the exit, and her delegation rose as one and followed her in perfect formation. "You cannot simply leave," the Azurian representative called out, and its mechanical voice synthesizer crackled with static. "The Council's authority." "The Council's authority ends where our sovereignty begins," Chen interrupted without turning back. "We came here in good faith, seeking partnership and cooperation, but you offer us only ultimatums and threats." She kept walking, and her footsteps echoed against crystal, as one by one her delegation fell in behind her, and they moved like a military unit, which several of them had been before joining the diplomatic corps. Kaiset's voice rang out one final time. "You are making a grave mistake, Ambassador Chen, and humanity will regret choosing pride over wisdom." Chen stopped at the threshold of the great doors, and for a moment she considered turning back, considered trying one more time to make them understand that humanity had not clawed its way up from Earth's gravity well just to accept chains forged by species who had forgotten what it meant to struggle. But she did not turn back. "The mistake," she said to the empty air before her, "would be believing that our refusal to submit equals a lack of wisdom. And we have learned many hard lessons in our history, and one of the hardest is this: freedom surrendered is rarely regained." She walked through the doors, and they sealed behind her with a sound like finality, and the human delegation moved through the station's corridors in silence until they reached their shuttle bay, where their ship waited like a patient bird of prey. Only when they were aboard and the airlock had cycled shut did Colonel Martinez speak. "They will not accept this." "I know," Chen said, and she moved to the communication console. "Send the authorization code to Earth, and tell the Congress that we have withdrawn from negotiations, and tell them to activate Protocol Sigma." Dr. Okafor looked up sharply. "Protocol Sigma, are you certain?" "I am certain of nothing, except that we will not surrender our future to beings who see us as children to be managed," Chen replied, and her fingers moved across the console. "And if they choose to make this a conflict instead of accepting our sovereignty, then they will learn what humanity becomes when backed into a corner." The ship detached from the station and turned toward the transit point that would carry them home, and behind them, the Galactic Council continued their emergency session, debating and arguing about the upstart humans who dared to defy their ancient authority. Most of the council members felt relief that the troublesome negotiations had finally ended, and some even smiled with satisfaction, believing that humanity would soon learn a harsh lesson about the price of defiance. But Kaisef did not smile, and she pulled up her private files on human history, scrolling through entries marked World War I and World War II and Mutually Assured Destruction and Total War Doctrine, and with each page her crystalline form seemed to dim with growing horror. She had studied these creatures, and she understood what the rest of the council refused to see, that humans were not like other species, that they had evolved in constant warfare with themselves and their world, that they possessed a capacity for both breathtaking violence and equally breathtaking compassion, and that when threatened, they did not calculate odds or consider surrender. They fought. They fought with everything they had, until either they won or nothing remained to fight with. And she thought of their old saying that she had found in their cultural archives, "Give me liberty or give me death." The council thought they were negotiating with a typical expansionist species, but Kaiseth knew the truth. They had just issued an ultimatum to a species that would rather burn the galaxy than bend the knee. She began composing her warning to the council, but she already knew they would not listen, and she watched the human shuttle disappear into the transit stream, carrying its cargo of defiant ambassadors back to a species that had just chosen war over submission and did not even realize it yet. The galaxy would soon understand what it meant to fight humanity, and Kaiseth suspected that understanding would come at a terrible price. The news spread across the galaxy at the speed of quantum-entangled communication arrays, and within 6 hours, every major civilization knew that humanity had walked away from the peace talks. On the Theran homeworld of Aquatis Prime, the collective's decision-makers rippled with satisfaction in their vast oceanic chambers, and they immediately began drafting economic sanction proposals that would strangle human trade routes and force the upstart species back to the negotiating table on their knees. The Kragor Empire received the news with barely restrained excitement, and Warlord Kethrak stood in his command center studying holographic maps of human space, counting the 340 colonies like a predator counting prey, and his tactical officers began drawing up invasion plans for the most vulnerable human settlements. Across 1,000 worlds, alien species discussed the situation with reactions ranging from amusement to mild concern, but very few took it seriously because humanity was just one species among thousands, new to the galactic stage and clearly inexperienced in the realities of interstellar politics. They would learn, the galaxy agreed, and the lesson would be swift. But on Earth, and across every human colony, the reaction was entirely different. The Terran Congress convened an emergency session within 2 hours of receiving Ambassador Chen's encrypted message, and representatives from Earth, Mars, Europa, Titan, and the 336 colonial worlds joined via real-time holographic link. Speaker Elena Volkov called the session to order, and her voice carried the weight of humanity's collective anxiety. The Galactic Council has issued an ultimatum demanding we dismantle 140 of our colonies and accept permanent restrictions on human expansion, and Ambassador Chen has withdrawn from negotiations and requests authorization to activate Protocol Sigma. Erupted in voices, but Volkov brought them to order with practiced efficiency, and representative after representative stood to speak, and not one of them suggested compliance. New Harmony's representative, a woman named Sarah Chen, no relation to the ambassador, spoke with quiet intensity. My colony was built by people who left Earth seeking freedom from overcrowding and restrictive policies, and we did not travel 40 light-years to accept the same chains in a different form. Representative Park from Tau Ceti added his voice. The Council sees our growth as aggression, but we see it as survival, and humanity has always needed room to breathe and to dream and to build. The vote came swiftly, and the Sovereign Defense Act passed with 98% approval, and only 3 representatives abstained, while none voted against it. Protocol Sigma was activated. Across human space, the transformation began immediately, and every civilian vessel received recall orders. Every mining operation tripled its output. Every construction yard that had built colony ships began retooling for different purposes. On Mars, the Olympus Mons shipyards, the largest construction facility in the Sol system, reconfigured their assembly lines. And where they had previously built one colony transport every 3 weeks, they now began producing something else entirely. In the asteroid belt, mining corporations that had spent decades harvesting resources for civilian use redirected everything to military production, and titanium, platinum, rare earths, and volatiles poured into processing centers at rates that shattered every previous record. Earth's population watched the developments with mixed emotions, and many felt fear at the prospect of conflict with species that had mastered space travel, while humans were still hunting mammoths. But others felt a grim determination that ran bone-deep in the human psyche. On every human world, military recruitment centers saw lines forming before dawn, and young men and women volunteered by the millions, and many were turned away because the military could not process them fast enough. The Terran Defense Force had existed primarily as a peacekeeping and system security organization, but now it expanded at a pace that shocked even its own commanders, and colonial defense militias activated across all 340 worlds. Intelligence agencies that had been monitoring the Galactic Council for decades began sharing information with military planners, and what they revealed painted an interesting picture of a galaxy that had grown complacent after 2,000 years of relative peace. The Council species fought wars, certainly, but they were measured affairs with established rules and accepted boundaries, and conflicts typically ended in negotiated settlements with clearly defined winners and losers, and the concept of total war had not existed in the galaxy for millennia. Humanity had different experience. Admiral Hassan Okonkwo stood in a classified military station orbiting Saturn, and he was a man who had studied military history his entire life, and before him floated holographic displays showing plans that made even his hardened staff officers pale. These protocols were designed for hostile first contact scenarios, his second-in-command said quietly, and Commander Rachel Kim had served under Okonkwo for 15 years, but she had never seen these particular files. "Sir, some of these weapons violate every treaty we signed with the Council." "We are no longer bound by those treaties," Okonkwo replied, and his voice carried the wariness of a man who understood the weight of what was coming. "The moment we withdrew from negotiations, those agreements became void." He gestured, and the displays changed to show ship designs, weapon systems, and tactical doctrines that humanity had developed in secret over the past century. Insurance policies against the possibility that the galaxy might not be as friendly as hoped. "We hoped we would never need these," Okonkwo continued, "but our species learned long ago to hope for the best and prepare for the worst." Kim studied the specifications for something called a Kasaba howitzer, a nuclear-pumped directional energy weapon that could vaporize targets at ranges previously thought impossible. And she felt a chill run down her spine. "How long have we been preparing for this?" she asked. "Since first contact," Okonkwo answered honestly. "We smiled and shook their appendages and attended their diplomatic functions, and the whole time our best minds worked on ways to fight them, if necessary, because humanity does not gamble its survival on the goodwill of strangers." Across the galaxy, Council intelligence services began receiving their first reports of human military buildup, and the initial analysis was dismissive, because humans were recalling ships and increasing production, which was expected behavior from a species facing sanctions. But a few analysts noted anomalies, and on the Vexhari homeworld, Kaiseth pored over every scrap of data she could gather about human activities, and what she found terrified her. Humanity owned approximately 8,000 registered military vessels, according to their declarations to the Council. But now her sensors detected construction signatures that suggested the real number might be 10 times higher. And those ships had been hidden in the outer reaches of human systems, dark and silent, waiting. She compiled her findings into a detailed report and requested an emergency meeting with the full Council, and they granted her an audience with obvious reluctance. "Luminar Kaiseth, your concerns about humanity are noted, but perhaps overstated," the Azurian representative said, and its mechanical voice carried dismissive tones. "They are one species, and we are 12, and they have no experience with interstellar warfare." Kaiseth projected her data before the assembled Council, and she showed them the construction patterns, the energy signatures, the movement of resources that painted a picture of a species preparing not for defense, but for total war. "You do not understand what you are seeing," she said, and her crystalline form resonated with urgency. "I have studied human history extensively, and they are not like us, and when threatened, they do not calculate acceptable losses or negotiate surrender terms." She pulled up historical records from Earth's own databases and displayed them for the Council, showing the wars that had consumed their homeworld, conflicts that killed millions and devastated continents, and ended only when one side achieved complete victory, or both sides exhausted themselves entirely. This is their nature, Kaiseth continued. They evolved as persistence hunters on a death world where everything tried to kill them, and they survived by refusing to quit, and they carry that trait into everything they do. The Theron representative rippled with what might have been laughter. You would have us fear them because they are stubborn, and many species are stubborn, Luminar. But stubbornness does not win wars against superior numbers and technology. Their technology may not be as inferior as we assume, Kaiseth countered, and she displayed specifications that her intelligence service had managed to obtain. They have been developing weapons in secret, and some of these designs violate our treaties, but those treaties no longer bind them. The council debated for hours, but ultimately dismissed Kaiseth's warnings, and they voted 8-4 to proceed with economic sanctions and to authorize a military coalition to enforce council authority if humanity did not comply within 1 standard year. Kaiseth returned to her quarters, feeling the weight of failure. Knew what was coming, even if the council refused to see it, and she began making private preparations to protect her own people from the storm she knew approached. Meanwhile, in the hidden shipyards beyond Neptune, the first of humanity's new dreadnoughts completed construction, and the vessel stretched 3 kilometers from bow to stern, bristling with weapons that had never been tested in combat, but had been refined through millions of simulations. Admiral Okonkwo received the completion report, and he stood at the viewport of his command station, looking out at the massive warship, hanging in space like a promise of violets. Name? He asked his aide. The crew has requested Indomitable, sir, the aide replied. Okonkwo nodded slowly, fitting, and let us hope they never learn how well we live up to that name. Across human space, 99 more dreadnoughts neared completion, and thousands of smaller vessels joined the growing fleet. Prepared for a war they had not wanted, but would fight with every ounce of strength they possessed. The galaxy continued to watch with amusement and dismissal and mild concern. But Kaiseth watched with dread, because she alone seemed to understand what the others refused to see. That humanity was not preparing to lose. They were preparing to win, or die trying. 6 weeks after humanity withdrew from the peace talks, Warlord Kethrak of the Kragor Empire made his decision, and he stood in the command center of his flagship, studying tactical displays with the confidence of a species that had never lost a war. The Kragor had conquered 47 different civilizations over 6,000 years, and their military doctrine was refined through countless victories, and they saw humanity's 340 colonies as ripe fruit waiting to be plucked. We will demonstrate to the Council that humanity can be brought to heel, Kethrak announced to his officers. And when the humans lose their colonies to our strength, they will beg to accept the Council's generous terms. His tactical officer highlighted a human settlement called New Harmony, and the world orbited a yellow star 43 light-years from Earth, home to 12 million humans who had settled there only 30 years prior. Minimal orbital defenses, the officer reported. Population primarily civilian, with standard colonial infrastructure, and our intelligence indicates no significant military presence. Kethrak's mandibles clicked in satisfaction. We will make an example and assemble 1,200 warships, and we will give the humans 1 day to evacuate, and then we will destroy everything they built. The Kragor fleet assembled over the course of 2 weeks, and it represented the largest military force the Empire had deployed in over a century. And they transmitted their intentions openly, because Kragor did not hide their strength, they displayed it. Humanity's intelligence services detected the buildup immediately, and emergency communications flashed between Earth and New Harmony at the speed of quantum entanglement. Governor Marcus Webb stood in New Harmony's crisis center, and he read the Kragor ultimatum with steady hands, though his heart hammered in his chest. Evacuate 12 million people. And even if we had enough ships, which we do not, they know we cannot comply. Colonel Sarah Chen, sister to Ambassador Chen, commanded New Harmony's defense force, and she studied tactical displays with the calm of someone who had prepared for exactly this moment. We are not evacuating, she stated flatly, and Protocol Sigma anticipated this scenario, and we have been preparing since the moment your sister sent the activation code. Webb stared at her. You have 2,000 Defense Force personnel and maybe a dozen orbital platforms, and they are bringing 1,200 warships. Orbital platforms that they can see, Chen corrected with a thin smile. And we also have every civilian ship in orbit, every cargo hauler, every mining vessel, every personal transport, and we have spent 6 weeks preparing them. She brought up new displays, and Webb's eyes widened as he saw what had been done, while he focused on civilian concerns. Every ship in orbit had been weaponized, every commercial vessel retrofitted with weapons that violated every treaty humanity had signed. But those treaties were void now. The cargo haulers carry mass drivers that can accelerate tungsten rods to relativistic velocities, Chen explained. The mining ships have laser arrays designed for cutting asteroids, but they work equally well on warship hulls, and the orbital platforms are not platforms at all. Webb leaned closer to the displays. What are they? Camouflaged weapon systems, Chen replied. Each one contains enough firepower to sterilize a continent. And we built them that way from the beginning, because humanity does not build colonies without the ability to defend them. She pulled up additional data, and the Kragor are not our only problem, because every civilian on this world has been training, and every able-bodied person knows how to fight, because we are a frontier colony. The Kragor fleet arrived precisely on schedule, and Warlord Kethrak broadcast his ultimatum with the arrogance of certain victory. Humans of New Harmony, you have 24 hours to evacuate this world, and after that time, we will destroy everything, and this is the price of your species' defiance. The response came from Colonel Chen, and it consisted of exactly 2 words. Come closer. Kethrak's officers bristled at the insult, but the warlord simply clicked his mandibles in amusement. They wish to die defending their dirt, and we will grant them that honor, and begin attack formation. The Kragor fleet moved into assault positions, and 1,200 warships arranged themselves in a pattern perfected through millennia of conquest. And their weapons powered up, targeting solutions calculated, boarding parties prepared for the cleanup after orbital bombardment. Then the civilian ships moved. What the Kragor thought were helpless cargo. Vessels suddenly pivoted with military precision, and weapons ports opened across their hulls. And the orbital platforms unfolded like deadly flowers, revealing the weapons they had hidden. But the true shock came from beyond the system. Reality tore open as hundreds of human ships emerged from faster-than-light transit. And these were not the commercial vessels the Kragor expected. And these were warships the galaxy had never seen. Vessels humanity had built in hidden shipyards and kept dark until this moment. Admiral Okonkwo commanded the human fleet from the bridge of the dreadnought Indomitable, and he watched the Kragor formation with cold calculation. They arranged themselves in a classic envelopment pattern, his tactical officer reported. They expect us to cluster around the planet for defense. They are fighting the last war, Okonkwo said quietly, and they do not yet understand that we fight differently and open fire, like a hammer forged in hell. And what the Kragor thought would be a simple conquest became a nightmare of violence and chaos. Mass drivers hurled tungsten rods at velocities that turned them into relativistic kill vehicles. And when they struck Kragor shields, the shields failed. And when they struck Kragor hulls, the hulls vaporized. Laser arrays designed for mining asteroids cut through warship armor like paper, and the beams were invisible in vacuum. But their effects were devastatingly visible, as Kragor vessels opened like flowers of fire and metal. But those were conventional weapons, and the Kragor had faced conventional weapons before. And what truly shocked them were the weapons humanity had developed in secret. Nuclear-pumped X-ray lasers detonated in precise patterns, and the explosions channeled their energy into coherent beams that could vaporize targets at impossible ranges. And antimatter torpedoes struck with yields that made fusion weapons look. Autonomous drone swarms poured from human carriers, and each drone carried enough processing power to make tactical decisions independently. And they learned and adapted with every passing second. The Kragor point defense systems could not keep up. Kinetic kill vehicles traveling at 90% of light speed struck without warning, because nothing could detect them until impact. And when they hit, they released energy equivalent to nuclear weapons without any of the radiation. The Kragor fleet tried to respond, but their tactics assumed an enemy would fight according to established galactic conventions. And humanity had never agreed to those conventions, had never promised to fight fair, had never suggested they would limit themselves to acceptable weapons. Within the first hour, the Kragor lost 300 ships, and Warlord Kethrak watched his tactical displays with growing horror as red icons blinked out of existence faster than his officers could react. Could track. They fight without honor, his weapons officer protested. They use prohibited weapons and swarm tactics and AI-guided munitions. They fight to win, Kethrak corrected, and understanding dawned with terrible clarity. They do not care about honor or tradition or acceptable casualties, and they will use any weapon and any tactic and any advantage, because to them, this is not a battle. It is survival. He opened communications to the human fleet. I request parley under the conventions of warfare. Admiral Okonkwo's face appeared on the display, and his expression carried no mercy. You came to my people's home and threatened to kill 12 million civilians, and now you request parley because you are losing, and I decline, and you wanted to show us the price of defiance, so we will show you the cost of aggression. The transmission ended, and the human fleet pressed their attack with mechanical precision, and the battle raged for 4 hours, until the outcome became inevitable. Of 1,200 Kragor warships, 1,197 were destroyed, and 3 managed to flee through emergency FTL jumps, damaged and desperate, carrying reports of what they had witnessed. The human fleet secured the system, and damage assessment teams moved through the debris field while New Harmony counted its own costs. 47,000 casualties, both military and civilian, from the initial Kragor bombardment, before the human fleet arrived. And Governor Webb walked through hospital corridors filled with wounded, and the price felt heavy, even in victory. Colonel Chen found him there, and her uniform was scorched from fighting fires during the attack. We held, she said quietly. At terrible cost, Webb replied. Freedom has always been expensive, Chen answered, and my sister told me something before she left for the peace talks, and she said that humanity must decide what principles are worth dying for. Because species without principles do not survive, and today we prove that human life and human sovereignty are principles worth defending. Across the galaxy, reports of the New Harmony battle spread with the speed of shock and disbelief, and the Kragor Empire reeled from the worst military defeat in their history, and other species began recalculating their assumptions about human capabilities. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session, and they could no longer dismiss humanity as inexperienced newcomers who would learn their place. Admiral Okonkwo made one broadcast to the entire galaxy, and his words were simple and absolute. Humanity did not seek this conflict, but we will not surrender to threats, and any attack on a human world will face proportional response. And we define proportional as whatever force necessary to ensure it never happens again. And we hope this message is clear. It was very clear. Kaiseth listened to the broadcast, quarters, and she felt no satisfaction in being proven right, only deep sadness at the waste and the suffering and the knowledge that this was only the beginning. The council would not accept this defeat, and they would gather their forces, and they would come in numbers that would make the Kragor fleet look small. And humanity would fight them too, because humans did not know how to quit. She began composing one final warning to her people, and she told them to prepare for a war unlike any the galaxy had seen in 2,000 years. Because humanity had just demonstrated something the Council refused to believe. They had shown that a species willing to die for freedom was far more dangerous than a species willing to kill for conquest. And the Council would learn this lesson, but the tuition would be paid in blood and fire. The galaxy watched, and now the watching carried a different tone, and the dread was no longer theoretical. The Galactic Council met in emergency session for 7 consecutive days, and the debate raged with an intensity that had not been seen in living memory. And the 12 species argued about honor and precedent, and the unacceptable reality that humanity had destroyed a Kragor fleet with apparent ease. The Theron Collective demanded immediate action, and their spokesperson rippled with barely contained fury. The humans have demonstrated flagrant disregard for galactic order, and they have used weapons that violate 17 separate treaty provisions, and they must be brought to account. The Azurian Federation agreed, and 6 other species added their voices to the call for military intervention, and only 4 species urged caution, with Kaiseth leading the opposition. You saw what they did to the Kragor, she argued, and her crystalline form resonated with desperate urgency. 1,200 warships destroyed in 4 hours, and if we pursue this path, we will suffer the same fate. The Theron representative dismissed her concerns with a gesture. The Kragor fought alone, and we will fight together, and 15,000 warships from 8 different species will overwhelm any defense the humans can mount. The vote came on the 8th day, and the result was 8-4 in favor of military action, and the Council authorized the formation of a peacekeeping coalition with a mandate to force humanity's compliance with galactic law. Kaiseth made one final plea before the vote was certified. I beg you to reconsider, and humanity does not fight like we do, and they do not calculate acceptable losses or seek negotiated settlements, and they fight until they win or until nothing remains to fight with. Then they will learn the price of such recklessness, the Theron representative replied, and perhaps nothing will remain. The coalition began assembling in council-controlled space, and 8 species contributed ships and personnel, creating the largest military force the galaxy had seen in 2,000 years. And 15,000 warships gathered in formations that stretched across entire star systems. Admiral Tuskven of the Azurian Federation assumed overall command, and he was a veteran of 40 campaigns over his 3-century lifespan, and he studied tactical reports of the New Harmony battle with professional interest. The humans fight with aggression and swarm tactics, he told his officers, but they lack experience with large-scale fleet operations, and our superior coordination will overcome their individual advantages. The coalition's strategic plan called for simultaneous strikes on 30 human colonies, and the attacks would demonstrate humanity's inability to defend its overextended territory, and human resistance would collapse once they understood the futility of opposing United Council authority. Humanity's intelligence services detected the coalition buildup within hours, and the scope of it sent shockwaves through military command, and Admiral Okonkwo stood in his command center, studying displays that showed 15,000 enemy ships preparing to attack. They outnumber us 3-1, Commander Kim observed quietly, and we cannot defend all our colonies simultaneously. We do not intend to defend, Okonkwo replied, and his voice carried grim certainty. And we intend to attack. Kim stared at him. Sir? Okonkwo pulled up tactical maps showing the coalition staging areas and the fleet formations and the supply lines that stretched across light years. They are assembling in predictable patterns, because they fight according to established doctrine, and they assume we will defend our colonies and wait for them to attack. But humanity's military history teaches us different lessons. He highlighted several locations on the map. We will strike their staging areas while they are still assembling their supply lines, and we will use the one advantage we have that they cannot counter. Which is? Kim asked. We are willing to accept risks they cannot imagine, Okonkwo answered. And we will split our fleet and accept inferior numbers at each engagement point, and we will use speed and aggression and weapons they have not seen yet, because we did not show them everything at New Harmony. The Terran Congress received Okonkwo's plan with shock and debate, and several representatives protested that it was too risky, too aggressive, too likely to result in catastrophic losses. But Ambassador Chen, recently returned from the failed negotiations, stood and addressed the Congress with the authority of someone who had looked into the Council's eyes and seen their contempt. The Council believes we will fight defensively, because that is how civilized species fight. And they believe we will accept reasonable losses and negotiate when the cost becomes too high. But if we fight by their rules, we will lose, because they have more ships and more resources and longer experience. She gestured at the tactical displays. Admiral Okonkwo proposes we fight by our rules instead, and we fight like humans have always fought when survival was at stake. And we take the initiative, and we strike hard, and we make them afraid. The vote authorized Okonkwo's plan, and the Terran Defense Force began moving into position, and 5,000 human warships deployed across 24 systems, and each fleet group carried weapons and tactics designed to shock and devastate. The first human strike hit Coalition Staging Area Gamma, while the Azurian and Theron fleets were still assembling, and the humans emerged from FTL at point-blank range, which violated every convention of fleet engagement, but humanity had never agreed to those conventions. 2,000 human ships struck 4,000 coalition vessels, and the battle was chaos from the first second. Human ships moved with reckless speed, closing to ranges where shields meant nothing and weapons fire could not miss. The coalition fleet tried to form defensive formations, but human ships wove through their lines like sharks through a school of fish, and autonomous drones deployed by the thousands, each one a thinking weapon that learned from every engagement. Then humanity revealed weapons they had not used at New Harmony, and gravity well generators activated, creating localized distortions in space-time that tore ships apart at the molecular level. And stellar mass drivers fired projectiles accelerated by magnetic fields powered by entire stars. Most horrifying were devices that could trigger solar flares and direct them toward enemy fleets. And the Coalition watched in disbelief as a human vessel deliberately flew close to the local star and deployed equipment that destabilized the stellar surface. And the resulting coronal mass ejection swept through the Coalition formation like the wrath of an angry god. The battle lasted 9 hours, and the Coalition lost 60% of the ships at that staging area, while humanity lost 40% of their attacking force. And by conventional metrics, it was a mutual bloodbath. But by human metrics, it was a victory, because the Coalition could not assemble at Gamma now. Human fleets struck 3 more staging areas over the next week, and each battle followed the same pattern. Human ships accepting brutal casualties to inflict greater destruction on Coalition forces, and the mathematics of warfare shifted in humanity's favor. Admiral Tuskven watched his carefully planned campaign collapse into desperate defensive actions, and he called an emergency meeting with Coalition commanders. The humans fight like madmen, and they accept losses that would break any sane species, and they use weapons that violate the very laws of civilized warfare. Then we should respond with overwhelming force. Theron commander argued, and we still outnumber them, and we gather our remaining fleets and strike at Earth itself. No, Kaiseth's voice interrupted via communication link. That is exactly what they expect, and humanity's defense of their homeworld will be absolute, and you will lose everything you send against them. The Vextari withdrew from the coalition, Tuskven said coldly, and you no longer have voice in military decisions. I withdrew because I saw this outcome coming, Kaiseth replied, and I tried to warn you, and now I am warning you again. If you strike at Earth, humanity will unleash weapons that will make everything you have seen so far look restrained. Tusk then ended the communication and ordered the coalition fleets to assemble for a strike on humanity's homeworld. But it took 3 weeks to gather the scattered forces, and by then humanity had used that time to prepare. The coalition's final fleet numbered 8,000 warships, was still the largest military force in the galaxy. And they jumped into the Sol system, expecting fierce resistance, but also expecting that their numbers would prevail. What they found was a nightmare. Every planet bristled with weapons, and every moon held defense platforms, and the asteroid belt had been transformed into a defensive network of unimaginable complexity. And humanity had spent 2 centuries fortifying their home system against exactly this scenario. The coalition fleet advanced, and human forces engaged them at the outer edge of the system. And the battle was brutal beyond description, because both sides knew this was the decisive moment. Human ships fought with suicidal courage and weapons that defied understanding. And the coalition watched as humans deployed devices that weaponized the very fabric of space itself, creating tears in reality that swallowed entire squadrons. But the coalition's numbers told, and slowly, inexorably, they pushed toward Earth, and human casualties mounted to levels that should have broken any species' will to fight. Then humanity played its final card, and Admiral Okonkwo broadcast a message to the coalition fleet. You have come to our home, seeking to destroy us, and you have forced us to reveal our ultimate weapon, and we hoped we would never have to use this, but you have left us no choice. Across the Sol system, platforms that the coalition had assumed were just additional weapons batteries activated, and they were not weapons at all, or rather, they were weapons of a different sort. They were FTL jump gates, and each one had been targeted at a specific coalition homeworld, and they opened rifings in space-time that connected Earth's system directly to the heart of coalition territory. You wanted to fight a war of annihilation, Okonkwo continued, and his voice was ice and iron. So we will give you one, and we have missiles poised to transit these gates, and they carry warheads that will sterilize your homeworlds, and if you do not withdraw immediately, we will launch them. The coalition commanders stared at their displays in shock, and every species in the coalition could see targeting data showing human weapons aimed at their mothers and fathers and children, and every person they had ever known. It was a bluff that was not a bluff, and humanity had built the capability to destroy coalition homeworlds, and they had not used it, because such weapons were monstrous. But they had built them and deployed them and armed them because humanity prepared for the worst while hoping for the best. Admiral Tuskven faced a choice that would define the galaxy's future, and he could order his fleet to continue the assault and watch his homeworld die, or he could surrender to a species that had been part of galactic civilization for less than 2 centuries. He chose survival, and the coalition fleet withdrew, and within a week, 17 council species sued for peace. Individual peace, and 3 council worlds faced human blockades that cut them off from galactic trade until they agreed to terms. The war lasted 8 months, and the coalition lost 92% of its fleet, while humanity lost 67%, and the casualty counts were measured in millions, and the cost was staggering. But humanity had won, and Admiral Okonkwo did not celebrate because victory tasted of ashes when purchased with so much blood. But he had kept his species free, and that had to be enough. Then humanity shocked the galaxy again, and they offered terms that were generous to the point of seeming weakness, and they would withdraw from council space and pay reparations for civilian casualties and help rebuild damaged infrastructure. They asked for only one thing in return: recognition of humanity's sovereign right to expand and govern itself without external limitation, and every species that had fought them agreed, because the alternative was mutual destruction. The galaxy accepted peace because humanity offered it, and if humanity had demanded conquest, the galaxy would have had no choice but to submit. But humans did not want to conquer, and they never had, and they just wanted to be free. 5 years after the war ended, the galaxy had transformed in ways that would have seemed impossible to the council species who had ruled for millennia. And humanity now controlled 890 worlds, more than any other species. But the expansion had brought cooperation instead of conflict. The memorial station hung in space at the exact coordinates where the Battle of New Harmony had raged, and it was built from salvaged metal from both human and Kragor ships, a monument forged from the weapons of war into a symbol of peace. Representatives from across the galaxy gathered for the dedication ceremony, and the station's central hall could accommodate beings of wildly different biologies, with environmental zones for aquatic species and methane breathers, and silicon-based life forms, and baseline oxygen breathers, like humans. Fleet Admiral Hassan Okonkwo stood at the podium, and he wore his dress uniform with the weight of 8 months of warfare visible in the lines on his face, and he was retired now, but the galaxy still knew his name and respected the man who had orchestrated humanity's desperate victory. "We did not want this war," he began, and his voice carried across the hall through translation systems. "And we came to the stars, hoping to find friends and partners and fellow travelers in the cosmic dark. But when we found masters instead, we had only one choice." He paused and looked out at the assembled representatives, and former enemies sat among former allies. And the Kragor sent a delegation led by Warlord Kethrak himself, who had survived the New Harmony battle and carried the scars to prove it. "Our history taught us that freedom, once surrendered, is rarely regained," Okonkwo continued. "And so we fought, and not because we are warriors or conquerors, but because we are human, and humans do not kneel, and we fight for the right to determine our own future." The hall remained silent as he spoke. That had fought against humanity, listened with an understanding born from bitter experience. And they had learned what it meant to face a species that valued freedom more than life. "They also learned from you," Okonkwo said, and his tone softened. "And we learned that the galaxy is vast and beautiful and filled with perspectives we had never imagined. And we learned that strength without wisdom leads only to destruction, and that victory without mercy is no victory at all." He gestured to the viewports, where the stars shone eternal and indifferent to the brief struggles of mortal beings. "Today we dedicate this station to everyone who fell in the war, and human and alien alike, and we remember them not as enemies, but as people who died because diplomacy failed, and because fear overcame understanding." Ambassador Chen Weilin took the podium next, and she had aged in the 5 years since walking out of the failed peace talks. But her eyes still held the fire that had carried her through those terrible months of negotiation and then warfare. "I stood before the Galactic Council and argued for humanity's right to chart its own course," she said. "And when they rejected that argument, I walked away, and I have asked myself many times if there was something else I could have said or done to prevent what followed." She looked directly at the council representatives in attendance, and several of them shifted uncomfortably. "But I have concluded that the answer is no, because the council did not want to hear arguments, and they wanted submission, and humanity could not give them that." Chen paused, and when she spoke again, her voice carried both sadness and determination. "The cost of our freedom was millions of lives, and damaged worlds, and shattered fleets. And that price was too high. And I wish we had found another way, but I do not regret that we fought. because the alternative was accepting chains that would have bound every human born from that moment forward. The Theron representative rippled forward and requested permission to speak, and Chen yielded the podium with a gracious gesture that would have been impossible during the war. "The collective acknowledges error," the Theron said, and its translated voice carried what might have been humility. "And we saw humanity as a problem to be managed, rather than a civilization to be respected. And we imposed our will, without understanding that some species cannot be ruled, and we have learned from our mistakes." Other council representatives added their own acknowledgments, and the Azurian Federation admitted that fear of humanity's rapid expansion had clouded their judgment, and the Kragor Empire offered formal apology for the attack on New Harmony. Warlord Kethrak approached the podium, and his massive frame still carried the bearing of a warrior, but something in his eyes had changed. "The Kragor have fought for 6,000 years, and we have won every war we initiated until we met humanity, and we thought you would fight like other species, and we were wrong." He looked at Admiral Okonkwo with what might have been respect. "You fought with a ferocity that matched our own, but combined with tactics and weapons we had never imagined. And you taught us that strength alone is not enough, and that courage and ingenuity matter as much as numbers and firepower." The dedication ceremony concluded with a moment of silence for the fallen, and millions of beings across the galaxy observed it simultaneously. And in that silence, humanity and the council species shared a moment of genuine understanding. Later, in private quarters aboard the station, Kaiseth met with Ambassador Chen, and the two had developed an unlikely friendship over the years since the war, and the Vexhari Luminar had proven instrumental in rebuilding trust between humanity and the Council. "You were right," Chen said quietly, "and you warned them what would happen, and they did not listen." Kaiseth's crystalline form resonated with complex harmonics. "I was right about your capacity for warfare, but I was wrong about your capacity for forgiveness. And I thought if war came you would conquer and subjugate your enemies, but instead you offered them generous peace." "We fought for freedom, not domination," Chen replied, "and once that freedom was secured, we had no reason to continue the violence." "That is what makes humanity truly dangerous," Kaiseth said, and there was admiration in her voice. "And not your weapons or your tactics, but your ability to switch from total war to genuine cooperation without transition, and you fight like demons, but make peace like saints." Chen smiled slightly. "We learned that we cannot survive in the galaxy alone, and we need trading partners and allies and friends, and holding grudges would accomplish nothing except isolating ourselves." She pulled up displays showing human colonies. Many of them now hosted alien populations who had immigrated seeking opportunity, and human medical technology had saved billions of lives across dozens of species. And human engineering firms were helping rebuild worlds damaged in the war. "We are pragmatic," Chen continued, "and the war cost us terribly, and we lost people we loved, and ships we needed, and resources we could have used for peaceful purposes. And we have no desire to repeat that experience." Kaiseth studied the data. "The Council wants to invite humanity to join formally, and not as a junior member, but as an equal voice. And they have drafted new articles that guarantee each species sovereignty over its own expansion and development." Chen considered this carefully. "We will need to discuss it with our Congress and people, but I think humanity would be willing to join a council that respects rather than commands. And we never wanted isolation. We only wanted to be free to grow and thrive on our own." "Terms. The galaxy has learned that those terms are non-negotiable," Kaiseth observed. "Yes," Chen agreed, "and we hope the lesson did not have to be taught through warfare, but we will not apologize for defending our freedom." On Earth, in a small garden in Beijing, Ambassador Chen Wei-Lin's sister tended plants with her granddaughter, and the child was 8 years old, and she had been born during the war, and she knew the stories, but had never experienced the fear that had gripped humanity during those terrible months. "Grandmother, was the war worth it?" the girl asked, and she plucked weeds with careful fingers. Chen paused and looked up at the sky, where stars were beginning to appear in the twilight. And somewhere up there among those stars were 890 human worlds, and countless billions of humans, living free because their grandparents' generation had refused to surrender. "War is never worth it," she said carefully, "but freedom always is, and because we fought for it then, you will never have to fight for it now. And that is the bargain every generation makes. We sacrifice so the next generation can dream." The girl considered this with the seriousness that children bring to important questions. "What if someone tries to take our freedom again?" Chen smiled, and it was not a kind smile. "Then we will remind them of the lessons we taught the Council. And humanity does not forget how to fight, and we only choose not to." Across the galaxy, humanity's reputation had solidified into something that commanded both respect and caution. And the war had demonstrated that humans could be fierce beyond measure when threatened. But the peace had demonstrated that they could be generous beyond expectation when treated fairly. New species entering galactic civilization received briefings about humanity. And the briefings emphasized both humanity's capabilities and their general desire for peaceful coexistence, cooperation, and the underlying message was clear. Treat humans fairly, and they will be excellent partners, but threaten their freedom and face consequences. Human colonies continued to expand, but now with Council acknowledgement, and even cooperation, and alien species helped with terraforming projects, in exchange for human assistance with their own development. And trade between humanity and other civilizations flourished. The military buildup that had shocked the galaxy during the war was gradually reduced, and humanity maintained a powerful defense force, but no longer felt the need to hide shipyards or conceal capabilities. And transparency replaced secrecy because the galaxy now understood that human strength was real and permanent. Admiral Okonkwo spent his retirement teaching at the Terran Naval Academy, and young officers listened to his lectures with reverence. And he taught them both the tactics that had won the war and the wisdom that had secured the peace. "Always be prepared to fight," he told each graduating class, "but always prefer to talk, and war is a tool of last resort, not first response. And we won our war, but victory cost us millions of lives, and that is a price we paid because we had no choice. But it is not a price we should pay carelessly." The memorial station at New Harmony became a pilgrimage site for beings from across the galaxy, and humans came to remember the sacrifices made for freedom, and aliens came to understand the species that had changed the galaxy's balance of power. On the station's walls, names were inscribed in 100 different languages and scripts, and every person who had died in the war was remembered regardless of which side they had fought for. And humanity insisted on this because they understood that the enemy dead were someone's children too. The galaxy watched humanity still, and the watching continued. But the dread had transformed into something else, and now the galaxy watched with wonder at a species that could be so terrible in war and so generous in peace. And they watched with hope that humanity's example might show other species a better way. And humans continued doing what they had always done, and they built and explored and dreamed and pushed boundaries and refused to accept limits on what was possible. And they made mistakes and learned from them, and forgave those who wronged them, and asked forgiveness when they wronged others. They were dangerous and kind, and stubborn and adaptable, and violent and peaceful, and all the contradictions that made them human, and the galaxy had learned to accept them on those terms. Because in the end, humanity had taught the galaxy a simple lesson that would echo for millennia. Some species you can rule, and some you can negotiate with, and some you must simply accept as equals on their own terms. And humanity would accept nothing less than equality. The stars shone on as they always had, Beneath those stars, humans and aliens worked together to build a future that neither could have built alone. And the galaxy moved forward into an uncertain tomorrow, carrying the hard-won wisdom that freedom was worth fighting for, and peace was worth building, and both required courage of different kinds. The human chapter of galactic history had begun with conflict, but it would be written in cooperation, and the future remained unwritten, but filled with possibility. And that was exactly how humanity preferred it.